public meeting. As I said, we'll give folks just a little bit more time to let the room fill in. All right, I'm being told we're live on Facebook. I just want to acknowledge the slide that's on the screen. What we're doing here is just kind of letting you know all that information you've filled out or previously filled out is in an effort to meet our promise of a Beltline for all. We're collecting this demographic information from all of you. We want you to know that the information is strictly used for our internal research purposes to assist us in guiding outreach and public engagement efforts. We will not distribute this information to other organizations. All right, let's go ahead and kick things off. I want to welcome everyone to this virtual space. Good evening. It's a little chilly out there, but hopefully you guys are warm in your homes. And welcome you to the combined North Side and West Side study group. Tonight, we'll be discussing the Beltline Transit Study. Thank you for participating in tonight's virtual public meeting. My name is Nathan Soldat. I'm the Director of Community Engagement for Atlanta Beltline Inc., also known as ABI. Our role is to be the organization responsible for implementing the entire vision of the Atlanta Beltline, including transit. We have enabled live transcription, and if you'd like to view this option, please click Live Transcript at the bottom of your screen to select your preferences. At this time, I will provide an overview of the meeting format for tonight. We are joined by, looks like 18 people on our Zoom platform. We also are broadcasting live to Facebook. If you're watching on the Zoom platform or Facebook Live, you can follow along on the agenda at the top of each slide. If you happen to be listening by phone, I'll walk us through the agenda right now. Tonight, we opened up with a welcome, some meeting logistics. We're going to follow this with audience polling, a Beltline 101 to ground the room, and then we're going to really dig down into the technical aspects, background, and where we're at with the Beltline Transit Study. Now, a little housekeeping here. Please do not place any questions in the Q&A box until we get to that portion of the agenda. Questions placed in the Q&A box prior to the completion of the presentation will be dismissed to ensure that everyone has had an opportunity to hear the presentation without distraction. Dismissed questions can be retrieved in the answer section of the Q&A box and pasted back in the live portion of the Q&A box when the presentation is complete. So they're not gone forever. We just want to stay focused. We have a lot of information to present. With regards to our meeting format, you've probably noticed now that your line is muted and you will not be able to share your video screen during the meeting. And this is to provide the best listening experience for everyone online. A recording of this meeting, the presentation, and any other supporting materials will be made available at beltline.org/meetings. If you're having any technical difficulties during the meeting, please email engage@atlbeltline.org. Should we encounter any technical difficulties, we appreciate your patience as we sort them out. So before we get into the actual study itself, I mentioned we're going to do some audience polling to get a sense of the virtual room. As we start the poll, you should see a question pop up on your screen. This feature is not available if you've called in or are viewing in Facebook Live, but I will read the results to the group, with the first question being, what neighborhood do you live in? And we chose kind of broad categories here. We had too many neighborhoods to fit across the geography. So are you in a Beltline neighborhood in Northeast, Southeast, Southwest, or Northwest Atlanta? Maybe you're in a neighborhood that's not a Beltline neighborhood. Or perhaps you're in a neighborhood that's outside the city limits of Atlanta. So we're going to look for 80+% participation, striving for it. Didn't quite get there, 78%, oh, 84, let's lock that one in. So we have representation from Northeast, Southwest, Northwest, other city neighborhoods in Atlanta, and an individual outside the city limits. Next poll, how long have you lived in your neighborhood? So our categories are 1 to 5 years, 6 to 10 years, or 11 or more years. Let's see if we can get above 80% again. We got 20 people in the room. All right, so with 85% participation, we'll lock that in. We have 5 people 1 to 5 years, 5 people 6 to 10 years, and 7 people 11 or more years. That's fantastic. Now tell us, with a multiple choice option, pick a couple if you want, your relationship to the Beltline. trail user, homeowner in a Beltline neighborhood, renting a home, a residential landlord, or business owner, or commercial landlord, all in Beltline neighborhoods, developers, real estate brokers, broadly speaking, community activists and advocates, or perhaps you just have general interest in the project. And I won't mention the percents on this one because we have multiple choice. We're at about 71% participation. This one takes a little bit longer as people are making multiple selections. And we'll go ahead and lock that in, 80% participation, a lot of trail users, a lot of homeowners, some renters, residential landlord, business owner, developer, real estate broker, and a couple community activists. Generally speaking, we have a lot of interest in the project as a whole. All right, next question. What are you most likely to be doing on the trail? Again, this is going to be multiple choice. We'll give you a little extra time. Exercising or other recreation, running errands, getting to work or school, engaging in leisurely activities, or perhaps you do not use the trail. There. All right, we can go ahead and lock that in. We got to 76% on that one. We are across all the categories with exercising and other recreation and leisurely activities at the top there. Running errands wasn't too shabby either. All right, next question. How much do you think about Atlanta Beltline Transit? Excuse me. How much do you think Atlanta Beltline Transit will improve quality of life and mobility in the northwest quadrant of Atlanta? And this is going to be a single choice. Up to 23 participants plus Facebook Live. Trying to give folks a sense of what the room feels like when you can't see it. So that's what we're doing right now. So we'll go ahead and lock that in, 69% participation. We got 56% very significantly, 19% somewhat significantly, 19% not very much, and 6% not at all. Last question, real simple, yes or no, is tonight your first Beltline meeting? We mean in person, we mean virtual, we mean over the last 20 almost years, since 2015, excuse me, since 2005, when we started having Beltline public meetings. And at 73% 78% participation, we can lock that in. And we have a lot of returning Beltline meeting individuals. We do have one person who's their first meeting. We welcome you to this space. We hope tonight is a positive experience for you and you get to learn all about the Beltline Transit Study. But we also want to ground the room. You know, we talked about trails a little bit there. We're certainly here to focus on transit. And we always have at least one or more individuals who have not been to a Beltline public meeting. And for that reason, we always like to present just a quick Beltline 101. So let's go ahead and do that at this time. The Beltline means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Ultimately, the Beltline was a project that was conceived to be a transportation and transit project, a 22-mile loop encircling the city of Atlanta, within the city of Atlanta boundaries, using old industrial, abandoned or underutilized rail lines and repurposing them, giving them new life to reconnect the city. We're doing that through a host of different programs. So tonight we're really focused on transit. The idea is to have a 22-mile loop of transit around the city, roughly 22 miles. This would be connecting into the MARTA heavy rail and bus systems. It'd also be providing additional options for folks who are not able to use the trail or don't want to use the trail. Maybe it's inclement weather like tonight. This is also a program of trails. So we have a goal of 33 miles of multi-use trails. This is a 22 roughly mile loop along with connector trails, but I suspect that'll be a lot more when it's all said and done, because if you think about it, the Beltline is sort of the hub for the trail network of the city. We're connecting a lot of different things. We're connecting 1,300 acres of new green space. We're connecting 5,600 units at a minimum of affordable workforce housing. We intend to blow that target out of the water. We have goals of $10 billion in economic development. We also have a massive public art and culture program. We have lots of different events related to that. We have visual arts, we have performing arts. You may have heard of the Lantern Parade. We pay the artists and it's all open and free to the public. As we move around the corridor, These were old rail lines for the most part, not so much in Northwest Atlanta. But we find that we have a lot of different cleanup to do, environmental cleanup with a lot of the industrial uses that dotted the corridor itself. We do all these different things uh, with the help of you through our community engagement program. And that's one of the things that you're experiencing tonight. And I think it's really important to also put a lens around the work that we do. And that is our vision statement. Our vision is to be the catalyst for making Atlanta a global beacon for equitable, inclusive, and sustainable city life. Now, that's a pretty high target. We can't do this alone. We do it with a lot of partners, but we want to drive change in the city of Atlanta. And we are very committed to this vision. So all these elements make up the Atlanta Beltline project. I'm glad you guys could take a quick walk with me along the Beltline and learn about the full portfolio project. But at this time, I would like to hand things over to Sean Green. He's our principal engineer. He's also the project manager for the Beltline Transit Study. Mr. Green?
Thanks, Nate. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. I want to give a brief overview of what it is that we're going to talk about, and then we'll get into some details specific to the Northwest and then specific to the Southwest and Southeast as well. But overall, the transit vision for the Atlanta Beltline is about creating equitable and sustainable solutions for access and mobility, transportation, as well as economics. And so, regardless of weather, regardless of wealth, regardless of geography, and regardless of ability, everybody will be able to make use of the Atlanta Beltline corridor with the transit program as we are envisioning it. It adds to the already amazingly successful trail program that we have, and we'll be able to provide a lot more in the way of mobility for people that live on one side of town and trying to get to the other side. So next slide, please. The big picture here is our study area is looking at the Northwest, the Southwest, and the Southeast. The Northeast quadrant of the city, a transit study was done by MARTA roughly 2 years ago. And the purpose of what we're talking about tonight is to look at the balance of the Beltline loop and to really focus in on the Northwest for the purposes of finding a viable, feasible, high-performing transit alignment between Bankhead and Lindbergh MARTA stations. And then on the Southwest and the Southeast, we're looking at, since we already own those corridors and we have a pretty good idea as to where transit's going, we want to really start to dive into where the stations end up and start to filter that through our analyses. So we're going to come back to these goals over the course of the presentation tonight. Connectivity, sustainability, and equity are three kind of outward-facing goals. Our implementation and operations goal is kind of more of an inward-facing, in that we're trying to make sure that what we come up with is going to be as appropriate is probably not the right word, as operationable, if that is a word, as possible, making sure that we don't come up with something that transit just can't do. So next slide, please. In the typical transit planning process, we are well into the preliminary planning element of it. We have the idea as to what we're trying to do. There's been a lot of work over the course of the last almost 20 years. But the last real deep dive in looking at the Beltline kind of system-wide as a 22-mile loop was done about 12 years ago. And so it was time to kind of dust that off and rethink through some of the assumptions. So really what we're doing with this alternatives analysis is we're trying to define the project in terms of what is the route, what is the alignment that's going to take, what are the stations that we're going to end up with. And then when we have all of that nailed down at the end of this process, we'll be able to hand MARTA a lot of deliverables, a lot of documentation, and then they can start to define the how which is what happens with the design work that would follow before they get into construction and then operations and maintenance. So I think the next, actually, yeah, Alex, can you hit the next slide, please? Okay, so our partners in this, MARTA and the City of Atlanta, um, are, we're working pretty tightly, not only in general, but also specific to this transit plan. Um, MARTA is the transit plan and implementer and operator for the City of Atlanta. That hopefully is pretty apparent to everybody with the heavy rail and the bus system, and then the more MARTA program of projects, which is the half penny sales tax for 40 years. And then the city of Atlanta obviously stood up the Atlanta Beltline program of projects with our organization with enabling legislation in 2005. And then, currently the city is the representing entity of the voters who are paying the sales tax for the MARTA high capacity transit projects that are envisioned. So on behalf of, the city, Atlanta Beltline, is the implementation agent. And we have lots of other partners, as Nate mentioned as well. So MARTA is our transit partner, just like Path Foundation is one of our trail partners, or Trees Atlanta is our arboretum partner, and we've got plenty of housing partners as well. So this falls well within the kind of the standard setup that we have set for trying to get all of these programs that we are responsible for delivered through our partners and with our partners. Next slide, please. So Atlanta Beltline as an organization has, a lofty goal of, equity priorities, if you will. One of the big ones is trying to balance out geographically the the services that are available, the infrastructure that's available across the city, and regardless of geography. Similarly, we're trying to make sure that the economic development aspects and access that exists in some parts of the city and not in others, that we can really start to balance that out as well. So there's that evil line between 10 o'clock and 4 o'clock. If the city were a clock face, and north of that line, north and east of that line, there is uh, probably 90% of the jobs within the Beltline planning area, and south and west of that is probably only about 10%. So we're really trying to make sure that organizationally in all of our programs are really trying to balance that out and create more opportunity in South and Southwest Atlanta. Next slide, please. And so specific to the Beltline Transit program, um, ultimately it's part of the economic development engine that is the Beltline, trying to stimulate growth and development, provide options for transportation, link up affordable housing with affordable transportation to maximize the value to those community members that need that the most. And also make sure that we have the social programs in place to minimize displacements of legacy and long-term residents. So the infrastructure is one element, but delivering the infrastructure without considering the social impacts is that's kind of the old way of doing it. And what Beltline has been doing, and a lot of transit properties around the country have been doing, is really starting to think about how the addition of infrastructure, trails, transit, whatever, really has some social impacts positively and negatively, and really try to mitigate the negative ones. Next slide, please. We kicked this study off just over a year ago in the fall of last year. We've done a lot of work. We took a brief pause in the springtime to adjust to the announcement of MARTA infill stations from Mayor Dickens in the State of the City address in the spring. And so we are here in the fall of 2024. Tonight, we're going to talk about Northwest in terms of potential corridors that transit could serve. And we'll talk a lot about station locations on the south side of the Beltline in the Southwest and the Southeast. Ultimately, we're only part of the way through the analyses that we're doing. But this is kind of the first step. We got to define where we're going to be. Um, geographically, and then we can come up with service plans, and then we can determine ridership. We can determine cost estimates for both the capital costs and the operations and maintenance costs. Ultimately, what we're trying to do is have deliverables and technical recommendations within the first quarter of 2025, and then really go back out to the community, present what we have found, obtain more feedback, and develop really a final recommendation for a locally preferred alternative. And then we can close out the project and move it from Atlanta Beltline over to MARTA for implementation as the funding stream is identified. Next slide, please. So going into Northwest, into the weeds. In the next slide, please. Again, we're looking at the shaded pink area is the study area. You'll see why it's that shape in a minute or two. But generally, what we're trying to do is find like I said earlier, viable and operationable transit corridors between Bankhead and MARTA Lindbergh Center stations. There's a lot of stuff that's in the area right now, in addition to the communities and the activity centers. There's also two active freight railroads and a freeway that we're going to have to figure out how to cross. And so we've done a lot of work. The Northwest is kind of an elephant, and you can't just eat it in one bite. So we did come up with an approach that we think is pretty defensible and hopefully very understandable as well as to how to kind of chip away at this big thing. Alex, if you can hit, thank you. So back to the goals. You can again see connectivity, sustainability, and equity. Those are the three outward-facing goals. And then we have our inward-facing goal with respect to operations and implementation. So ultimately, we are kind of scoring, if you will, we're screening against these goals and objectives with some performance metrics that we'll talk about in the next couple of slides. If you can hit the next one, please. And then just in terms of process. So like I said, Beltline was stood up in 2005. The last big look at transit kind of as Beltline wide was in 2012. There'd been other work that's since been done, but looking at it kind of holistically and really trying to dig into the Northwest and come up with some viable alternatives. And then ultimately, of those viable alternatives, one of them will float to the top and perform higher than the others. And that's the one that we're looking for as we go through these analyses. And then ultimately, that one that floats to the top is probably going to be our locally preferred alignment, our locally preferred alternative. And then that can be handed off to MARTA for starting up with the NEPA environmental process. So NEPA it's an acronym, it stands for National Environmental Policy Act. It's a federal umbrella law, if you will, that incorporates all kinds of other environmental laws as well. It was signed in 1970, so it's not all that old. But basically, what is required is that whenever the federal government spends federal money on projects, that there has to be an environmental document that kind of documents the process and the decision making to get to the final conclusion. So we're in the alternatives analysis step right now, trying to get to an LPA, a locally preferred alternative, and then with that LPA, then the environmental process will follow that. Next slide, please. So like I said, hopefully this is understandable and relatable. Instead of trying to find direct corridors initially, what we did was we broke up the Northwest quadrant into three sections where we had a western section, a central section, and an eastern section. And then we developed some smaller segments within each one of the sections so that again, we could do a little bit more chipping away as opposed to trying to eat the elephant all at once. So we have 5 different segments in the west, we have 8 in the central, and we have 5 different segments in the east as well. And those 18 segments are all screened against a set of 9 criteria. And we'll go through that on the next slide, Alex, if you don't mind. Thank you. Um, so each one of the 18 segments is going across the top here, and then the criteria is the first column. So as you go down the columns, you can see connections to MARTA high capacity transit, connections to the trails network, connections to activity centers and affordable housing. And then we looked at transit dependent populations as well as equity inclusion priority populations and populations that would probably have a propensity or a likelihood to use transit. um, Engineering feasibility and right-of-way ownership, those are getting at the inward-facing goals of operationability. I keep making up that word. I'm going to keep using it, see if it sticks. Um, but basically, we wanted to make sure that what we're coming up with makes sense, that it's physically possible to actually operate it. And you can see if you go to W2, which is the second segment at the top, and then follow it down to the engineering feasibility, you can see that there's a fatal flaw. And basically, what that was the total grade change for a section of W2 was well beyond what any transit vehicle could achieve. So I'm making up a number, but let's say it was like 18 to 20%, and the maximum grade that the vehicles can really do for even a short stretch is, say 7 or 8%. So that section or that segment was screened out because of that fatal flaw. And we'll go through these with some maps over the course of the next couple slides, so you'll be able to. Thank you, Alex. So the first one was connections to MARTA high capacity transit. Um, you can see some half-mile buffer circles around the 4 MARTA stations that are closest to the northwest quadrant. So that's Bankhead in the bottom left, Midtown in the right, Arts Center in the right, and then Lindbergh Center up at the top right. And so the sections, or excuse me, the segments that are closest to the existing MARTA stations scored higher than the segments that are farther away. So it's all about proximity as our way to identify those connections. Next slide, please. And then this is connections to the trail network. So we looked at the Beltline Trail as it currently exists and as it is being planned. And so transit segments that are closer to the Beltline Trail score higher than transit segments that are farther away from the trail network, trying to make sure that we can have as much connectivity between trail and transit as possible. Next slide, please. Transit dependent populations, we define this as a 0 vehicle household. So this is information that we gleaned from census data. The darker the purple within the study area represents a higher percentage of 0 vehicle households. So the closer the transit segment is to the darker purple communities, blocks, whatever you want to call it, they score higher than the segments that are farther away from the dark purple. Next slide, please. Similarly, transit propensity, we define this as kind of the combination of low-income households and senior populations. So in green, the darker the green is the higher percentage of low-income households, and then the darker the, call it blue, is the higher percentage of population that are 65 and older as seniors. And then when you overlap those two, and they often do, that the darkest color there, that green gray, is kind of the highest population or the highest percentage of population that is both low income and senior. So again, it's all about proximity. The transit segments that are closer to the dark are, excuse me, to the darker areas within the study area score higher than the transit segments that are farther away. Next slide, please. So from those 18 segments, the initial results from that first screen ended up with 2 in the West, although I think that W2 we screened out for that fatal flaw, ended up with 4 in the Central and 3 in the East. And from these segments that kind of floated to the top from that first screen on the next slide, you can see that we've taken those segments and turned them into continuous transit corridors that link up the Bankhead area up to the Lindbergh area. So if you look at alternative 1, which is the red line, that's generally following the CSX corridor. If you look at the, let's go with light blue and green, however they come across from the Norfolk Southern corridor, the light blue and the green then end up getting into the Peachtree Road corridor to go up towards the CSX corridor and then continue east along CSX. And then the purple and the dark blue, as they come out of they really kind of stay in the Norfolk Southern corridor, and they end up serving the Armor-Otley area, making use of, like I said, Norfolk Southern and some Georgia DOT right of way over there. So that's very high level explanation as to what these 5 corridor alternatives are set up to serve. If we hit the next slide, you can see the initial results from the segment analyses and that screening before, and then how we turned those sections and segments into continuous corridors. Next slide, please. And then we came up with some preliminary station locations for each one of the alignments. And they were based on existing zoning, future land use, and the future land use is getting at population and employment density. So that future land use is coming from the City of Atlanta Comprehensive Development Plan. We also looked at, social vulnerability and trying to make sure that we would have stations that would be in close proximity to, the population centers with the seniors or the low income residents or those with zero car households. But we also wanted to make sure that we were as adjacent as possible to activity centers and employment centers. So Piedmont Hospital, for example, is, I think, the largest employment center within the Beltline planning area. So that's a great target to try to serve with transit. Atlantic Station as an activity center and a housing center and a job center is still probably only 60% built out with another 40% to go. So there's a lot of existing and future density at Atlantic Station that can make sense to serve. So there's a lot of very interesting analyses that we've got going on right now, trying to sort out which ones perform higher than others. And that's an ongoing set of analyses that we'll be able to report out on at the beginning of the coming year. Next slide, please. Yes. So what's next for the Northwest? So if we can hit that next slide. Ultimately, what we're doing is we're doing the analyses for the stations to see how they're performing in terms of ridership. We're going to be looking from a corridor perspective at the capital and operation and maintenance costs. We'll also be looking at the corridor level in terms of environmental impacts, whether it's ecological, whether it's social and cultural. We'll be looking at those at a high level as well. And then where we do have in-street runnings, if we what kind of transportation impacts we will have on the existing system. And some of these are, each one of these 5 alignments would be a great alignment for transit within the city. We're really only going to be able to pick one of them. So we're going to have to make and this is we as a collective city are going to have to make some decisions with the data sets that we're providing at the end of this study and ultimately pick a locally preferred alternative for the Northwest. So with that, we'll go into the Mentimeter, which is it's a it's a survey tool. Um, so if you're on a laptop and you have your phone, you can grab a QR code here and get into the Mentimeter website. If you just want to use your laptop or your phone without the QR code, you can go to menti.com and then that code 5968843 that will link you into this Beltline meeting in terms of the Mentimeter code because we've got a couple polling questions that we want to ask. And so here comes the first question. Dun dun dun. And I apologize, folks. I'm fighting a cold, so I'll be drinking a lot of water tonight to keep the voice going. So this is a prioritizing question. And basically the question is, what criteria or factors are most important when considering alignments or routes and station locations for transit? So what we want you to do is rank these 7 by importance. So your first most important would be moved to the top, and then your least important of the 7 moves to the bottom. So we'll give you guys a couple minutes to think about this and organize your thoughts. We've only got one person right now in the Menti, um, so that to have to have this make any sense, we're going to need a lot more participation than just one person. Oh, there we go. We've got 4 participants, 5. Yeah, thank you, Rashida. Rashida just put in the chat the website and the code. So it's 6 people. We have 29 attendees. So I'd like to get a lot more than just 6 or 7, 8, 9. Way to go, Alan. Yeah, we've got 11 people that have responded out of 30 attendees. So I'd love to get a little bit more participation on that, but we can't spend all night on it either. Well, with 12 respondents here, our first place, hopefully everybody can see this, but access for transit dependent populations is in first place with 14 participants, followed by proximity to homes and jobs, connections to MARTA, connections to trails and paths, accessible and equitable mobility options, and proximity to community centers and parks. That's 15. That's half of the number of participants we have, but I think we should probably go ahead and move on to the next question. And after we do this, we'll get to a screen that shows the map at a larger scale. So you guys can take a look at that larger map. But based on your top criteria or factors, which of the 5 alignment alternatives would you rate best? And so this is a single choice. Sorry, the colors in Menti don't line up with the colors on our map. Um, but Alex, if you can go back into the slide deck and share the last map in the Northwest. That way it's a little bit bigger and everybody can take a look at it. But I'll need your help, Alex, because if that map is up on the screen, I can't see the Menti. Well, maybe I can find it on my phone. So alignment or alternative one is the red alternative. That's, like I said, generally CSX. The other alternatives are generally speaking using Norfolk Southern, and then addition to that, alternative three and alternative two are also using Peachtree Road, Peachtree Street, Peachtree Road. And then alternatives four and five follow Norfolk Southern all the way through Armor Otley up towards um, up towards Lindbergh. And Alex, if you don't mind, can you tell me how many people have voted in the Menti? I don't want to submit a and skew anything. Oh, good. So we got 20 participants there. So what we have is we've got three people with alternative one, the CSX corridor, six people with alternative two, which is the light blue corridor that runs Norfolk Southern and Peachtree. Um, and then we've got five people looking at the third alternative, four people looking at alternative four, and two people looking at alternative five. So um, I think that that's, 21 out of 30, 29. Yeah, I think we'll call that close enough in terms of a percentage of the population that participated, and move on. Is there another Menti or are we go? Yeah, going back to the presentation. Excellent. So, um, what we're going to do right now is we're going to do a section of Q&A specific to the Northwest. Well, it's kind of fresh in your head, excuse me. So you
Right.
can go ahead, Nate,
Yeah, Sean, I got this. Why don't you grab a drink? I think you've given this presentation four times already this week. So,
today.
all right. So we're going to break things up a little bit. So we're going to address a few questions. We have a nice small group. We have some folks on Zoom. I'm thinking if we have any phone attendees at this time, but we do have Facebook Live. But I'm going to review all the ways in which you can be part of this conversation. So if you're on the phone, just hit *9 on your telephone keypad. That'll raise your hand. I'll see it. And when it's your turn, I'll push a little button over here and it's going to tell you in your ear to hit *6 to unmute yourself. If you're on the Zoom platform, just jump into the Q&A right now. I see people have already done so. You can also upvote or make comments on other people's questions or comments. If you'd like to raise your hand, you can do that, especially in this small format. We will prioritize phone attendees if they jump on. If you're on Facebook, go ahead and participate in the comments section. If we can't answer your question or comment there, we'll elevate it to the Zoom platform and address it in that format. So, all right, let's see what we got here. I'm going to start right at the top, Sean. All right, I'm going to read this for the group. Good stuff. However, this section in the Northwest, especially in the street sections, how would you coordinate with ATL DOT in regards to narrowing down the concerns of delayed traffic because we don't want a scenario like the streetcar. Sean?
Sure. Thank you, Brian. What we need to do and what we are doing is as we are going through our comparative analyses of the five different corridor alignments, we're looking at travel time, for example. What is the travel time from um, Bankhead up to Lindbergh on each individual alternative. And so we'll be able to compare and contrast that information with a lot of other information. And so if we're going to be in street in Atlanta DOT right of way, yes, we will obviously be having to have those conversations with Atlanta DOT to see if there's a way that we can, just from a policy perspective, really try to provide as much dedicated lanes for or dedicated guideway for transit in the Northwest as possible. Similarly, if we get into Peachtree Street, Peachtree Road, we're going to have to be coordinating with Georgia DOT because the section of Peachtree, basically north of West Peachtree, is all state highway. So there's that will come after the analyses of and the comparative analyses of each one of the um, corridors to figure out if one is if it's truly viable and high performing, except for travel time because of traffic congestion, that's when those conversations will start. It's not necessarily something that we need to take care of on the front side, but it will definitely help to filter out. It might be a deciding factor when all said and done. So we just don't know yet.
Okay. This is from Alan. On the full map of the proposed route around the Beltline, the east side seems to go pretty far off from the Beltline to Inman Park Station and King Memorial Station. Is Beltline proposing both corridors and connections to the stations, or are those just study areas to determine which corridor would be best?
Those are study areas to determine. Those are two two possible ways of dealing with getting over, under, or around. Well, actually, is dealing with getting around Halsey Yard, um, and then making sure that there's a quality tie-in to a MARTA station. So with the advent of the infill stations back from the spring, there is another potential now with a infill station, generally speaking, on the existing MARTA between uh, Inman Park Station and King Memorial Station. People are just, you can call it Krog, you can call it Halsey, but it's in the general vicinity, about halfway in between the two. Uh, don't know what that really looks like yet, but that is a potential alternative to the two. But the northeast quadrant, where all that information that you're talking about is not really part of our effort tonight, nor the overall Beltline Transit Study that was looked at by MARTA a couple of years ago, and that report is it was available on our old website. We've rebranded and re-websited our organizations, so I think it's up there. Um, but if it's not, we can try to put it up there. That way you can take a look at it.
All right, and a couple more questions here. We're gonna just take the questions that are in the Q&A box now. So we're gonna ask no additional questions. And then we're gonna jump back into the presentation. We'll have a whole another Q&A at the end. So regardless of the findings of the study, how would the funding and construction come about? This list of projects from more MARTA keeps shrinking and shrinking. Would the city build and contribute to infrastructure? Isn't that how MARTA ended up with the streetcar in their possession?
So, with your second question first, the streetcar has ended up in MARTA's possession. MARTA is owner and operator and maintainer of the streetcar, and that is paid for out of the more MARTA half penny sales tax from the city of Atlanta. Um, so that's how the city moved the streetcar, and that was a political decision by Mayor Reed 8 or 10 years ago. Well, not 10 years ago, but probably in 2016, 2017, when the referendum was voted and passed and the collection started. That I think that was when the transition of ownership occurred. Um, so to your first question, yes, there's going to need to be some other funding stream that is identified in addition to the More MARTA program, because of exactly what you're saying. Costs have gone up. The project list seems to be shrinking. And so when all is said and done, the more MARTA program of projects is roughly a $3 billion program, very round numbers, but over 40 years, pulling a lot of that money forward is, limits the number of projects that you can do. So there's going to need to be another set of funding identified or multiple funding sources identified to to bring the Beltline Transit fruition as envisioned.
All right, and I see another question popped in here. We're going to ask folks to hold their questions, and we're going to hit the last couple ones here. Based on the fact that the streetcar consistently maintains an 86% plus on-time performance rating and increasing, how is Beltline going to help market Beltline Rail and its construction?
So, yeah, that is a good question. That's a little bit beyond where we are right now. What we're trying to do is define what the project is. When there's more design work, that's going to define how that works. And as part of developing that how, there will be that information being whether you want to call it project marketing or education or whatever. Um, but when the project is going to go from design to construction, that's when the outreach in terms of construction mitigation starts during the design process and becomes a lot more um, real. Let's go with that. Once a contractor is on board. So there's a lot of different ways that that transit can be implemented in terms of streetcar. Uh, Primarily, it's a construction manager at risk type of construction contract. So you bring the contractor in early during the design process to help, you know, maintain cost controls, but also maximize constructability and make it as easy as possible by having that expertise at the table during the design. So there's a lot of things that need to happen before we get to that point. So I can't really answer your question other than to just say broadly um, that it is something that we are kicking around, but it's really not yet the time for that.
All right, I'm just trying to clear this out real quick. I want to
Yep.
be aware of time. Can you describe the big picture as a vision to have full circle loops going in both directions? Also, what lessons did we learn from the MARTA Northeast Quadrant study?
Um, so yeah, the Beltline transit vision is, the 22-mile loop. There would be clockwise and counterclockwise operation. So it's a double track transit type of system. As we're developing a couple different service plans. There's one where it's just kind of the Beltline loop unto itself. Then there's the Beltline loop with a crosstown alignment as well. So that would take into account the streetcar east and streetcar west extensions from downtown. And so that could be the Beltline loop plus a crosstown, or it could become a Beltline loop that goes on to the crosstown, or it basically cuts two Beltline loops. So there could be a north loop and a south loop. We're looking at a couple different potential service plans there, and then compare the ridership of them and the cost of operations. But we're doing the planning work with the intention of 10 to 15-minute headways during the peak periods. And so from ridership and headways and then carrying capacity, we will figure out what we need in terms of vehicles in order to provide the service as envisioned. And then lessons learned from the MARTA Northeast Quadrant. Um, we are trying to very much mimic the work that the MARTA consultant team had done. And actually, that consultant is one of the sub-consultants on this project. So they did a really good job with that project. And that was part of the reason that this team was selected for this procurement and this contract.
Is there a preferred route that the Beltline org will recommend to MARTA to accompany the public's preference?
Um, Not sure I completely understand what you're asking. So we haven't identified the preferred alignment yet. We're still trying to filter out through those five corridors. And so we will come up with a recommendation and a proposal. We'll bring that out to the community. We'll obtain feedback to see what the thoughts and feelings are, and then make a decision as to what we want the preferred alignment to be. And then that will be presented to MARTA.
All right, thanks, Sean. We can advance to the next slide. We will have time, a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. And I'm sorry for the hand that I did dismiss Brian. We will have time at the end. Thank you.
Awesome. Okay, so that was the Northwest, and we can have more questions about Northwest at the end of the presentation. But I also wanted to walk through some of the work that we've done in the Southwest and the Southeast. And most of this work is all about uh, station locations. So if you hit the next slide, please, Alex. In the Southwest, we had from previous analyses, really going back to the 2012 effort with the environmental impact statement. There are a bunch of potential station locations that were identified for the Southwest. You can see several of them here, but not all of them. On the next slide, we have the Southeast potential stations. You can see that there's a lot of them. And so when you're laying out transit, um, 10, 12, 15 years ago, the conventional wisdom at the time was to make it as accessible as possible. Put as many stations in so people can walk up to it. The problem with that is if you're trying to go a distance on that train, you end up having, a stop every quarter of a mile. And so your travel time will be um, long as a result. And so what we've done here is we've challenged the conventional wisdom of 10, 12, 15 years ago, and we've started looking at, do we really need all of these stations? And so we've gone through with our siting criteria here. Again, you can see the goals: connectivity, sustainability, equity as the outward facing ones, and then the operations as the inward facing one. And I'm really sorry for the small text, but it was just to try to get it all onto one slide. Um, these these slides will be available on our website, so you guys can come back and take a look, and drill into this a little bit more after the fact. Next slide, please. But we'll go through some maps here for the Southwest and the Southeast that are looking at the those performance metrics that were just in that table. Um, this map here is showing proximity to affordable housing. The yellow circles are Atlanta Beltline affordable housing developments where we either have an entire development or have invested within a development. Similarly, the purple ones are other affordable housing, and the bigger the circle, the more units that are available in that particular location. So these would have been done by either developers or Atlanta Housing or something along those lines. I don't know why we differentiated, but we did. So, but the station locations that are closer to the dots, representing the affordable units, score higher than the ones that are farther away. And again, for context, and this slide is fine for the context. Um, the white circles, kind of inside, closest to the station locations and the centroids of those stations, that is a quarter-mile buffer. And the dashed gray line on the outside of the that is a half-mile buffer. So that just gives you kind of a geospatial sense as to how close together each one of these station locations is. Um, this slide is getting at land use change and susceptibility to change. So um, the darker the color is the kind of more likely to redevelop. What that is that's opportunity to provide for more more housing, both affordable and market rate, as well as more commercial, affordable and market rate. And ultimately, when you can increase, the density with redevelopment, there's more people and therefore more potential riders. The difference in color here is just to differentiate southwest from southeast. So the kind of the red pink color is the southwest quadrant, and the orange tan color is the southeast. But that's the only differentiation. Excuse me. This is a map showing the existing MARTA system. So you can see the north-south red gold lines running through the up down on the screen, and then the blue green lines running left, right, east, west through the screen. Um, those are the existing MARTA subway. And then there's the proposals from the more MARTA program for other high capacity transit. Excuse me. You can see the Campbellton Road bus rapid transit proposal in the bottom left is the dashed blue line. The dashed blue line, kind of in the middle of the map, is the MARTA Summer Hill BRT bus rapid transit. That's under construction now. That runs from downtown down Hank Aaron, past the Georgia State Football Stadium, down to the McDonough Boulevard um, location in South Atlanta there. And the dashed red line is the proposed arterial rapid transit along Metropolitan Parkway. Um, so bus rapid transit is, well, maybe the way to do it is local bus has the bus stops every 2 or 3 blocks. An arterial rapid transit is it's an enhanced local bus trying to improve upon travel time by limiting the number of stops. So instead of stopping every block or three, it has a larger spacing between the stop locations um, to try to reduce the number of stops and reduce the overall travel time. Uh, and then bus rapid transit has stations that are even farther apart. It's basically set up to mimic kind of a light rail streetcar type of an operation, do it on rubber tires on asphalt, and try to get as much dedicated lanes as possible. Again, all trying to get at the most limited travel time, because usually those are on pretty big distance runs. So the closer the stations are to those high capacity transit projects and corridors, the higher the score, the farther away, the lower the score. Thanks, Alex. And this one here is looking at future land use. This is coming from the city's comprehensive development plan. So the darker the purple, the more dense the future land use is proposed to be, whether it's residential or commercial or mixed use. So the stations that are closer to the darker purple are going to score higher than the stations that are farther away from the darker purple. Next slide, please. And then this here is looking at travel sheds. We've got the quarter-mile and half-mile buffers around the stations from a regardless of how you do it. It's just a physical distance. But one of the other things we did with this was to look at how far do you have to go, or if you're going to try to get there on bike and you're within a mile and a half, what does that station coverage look like? And so that's what the purple is. The darker the purple is just kind of the overlap of multiple stations that have, a similar capture area. But the outside of the purple is that mile and a half bike shed. And so that's really getting at, and I guess I should have explained this earlier. Half-mile station buffer is really there as kind of a proxy for how much time it takes to get to the station. So usually people can walk about a half mile in about 10 minutes. And then the mile and a half bike is about a 10-12 minute bike ride as well. So that just gives you kind of a sense. Now, what we have done with the analysis is that we had 7 stations of the 12 that we looked at that kind of floated to the top. And that's based upon spacing, it's based upon activity, it's based upon all those metrics that we just kind of went through. In terms of the largest distance here, we've got 3/4 of a mile between the Joe Boone proposed location and the Donald Lee Hollowell Parkway proposed location, which are the top two stations there on the map. Which means that if you live exactly halfway between the two of them, for example, once you get to the Beltline corridor, it's only going to be 3/8 of a mile to get to one or the other. So the farthest you'd have to walk along the Beltline Trail would be 3/8 of a mile, which would be like an 8-minute walk as opposed to a 10-minute walk for a half mile. So one of the great things about the trail is the trail itself, but then also the trail becomes a wonderful linkage between the stations, the transit stations, so that as you get onto the Beltline, you have a wonderful experience to get to the transit as well. On the next slide, we have the Southeast, and we also found 7 stations here that floated to the top. The largest distance you can see is on the right side with Boulevard and Glenwood Park. Again, those are half-mile circles, so they're about a mile apart. We've already received some feedback that that's just too far. And so we're looking at, does United Avenue make sense as a stop location? Just maybe that's a third of a mile away from Boulevard. It's right at the edge of that 1/4 mile buffer. So we're looking at that to see if it makes sense to add a station there based upon that feedback. But there's really not much in the way of density in between, other than the fact that there's the Trestle Tree Apartments at United. That's about 13 acres. They've got some tax abatements that continue for another year or 3. But at some point, maybe that becomes an opportunity to densify and redevelop to add additional affordable and market rate housing, maybe some commercial there. And then if something like that is present, then it probably does make sense to add another station location in that vicinity. So we're doing a little bit more looking at that. But you can see these 7 locations here. The next map will show, a lot cleaner what we're looking at in the Southwest. So if you start at the top and work down, we're looking at a station in the vicinity of Donnelly Hollowell Parkway, just down from the Bankhead MARTA station, just east. And then we're looking at a transit station for Beltline Transit at Joe Boone. And this is a location where we would have a connection with the MARTA heavy rail. It would be an infill station halfway between the Ashby station and the Bankhead station. But where the Beltline and MARTA are effectively collinear here, it really makes sense to make that connection at that location. There'd be another station at MLK Jr., another one down south of 20 at Anoda Park in the Westview community. The Ralph David Abernathy Boulevard stop is in the vicinity of Gordon White Park in the Kroger City Center that's there. And then there'd be a proposed stop at Lawton Street before you get down to a proposed stop at Murphy Avenue. And again, Murphy Avenue is one of those infill station locations. So it would be a new MARTA station on the existing MARTA track between the existing West End station and the Oakland City station. So the intention is to open up additional access to the MARTA heavy rail system and provide a lot more access for the community that's there and the community that's coming. So that's the Southwest. In the Southeast, we'll continue in the kind of counterclockwise motion from Murphy. The next station location would be at Metropolitan Parkway. Excuse me. The next one after that to the east is Pryor Road and then Milton Avenue. And calling it Milton Avenue may not serve it, do it all the justice that it deserves. It'll be somewhere between Hank Aaron and Milton, McDonough Boulevard, with the turnaround and the end of line of the MARTA Summerhill BRT plus the roughly 40 feet of vertical grade separation between the street at Hank Aaron and the Beltline corridor down at the bottom there. There's going to be a pretty big ramp system. So even though Milton's at grade, with that crossing, the the station there is probably going to slide away from Milton and towards the ramp system, to try to make that transfer as easy and clean as possible between Beltline Transit and the MARTA Summerhill BRT. East of Milton is Hill Street, and then up to Boulevard, and then up to Glenwood. So we're going to be looking at, if United, what we need to see at United to make that make sense to have a station installed. The next slide just kind of shows all of Southwest and Southeast, so you can get a sense of cadence, and spatial relationship of the different station locations for the Southwest and the Southeast. So we're going to go back into a Menti here. But Alex, before you get to the Menti, if you don't mind, just if we can stay here for a second and just let people kind of absorb that for 30 seconds to a minute, and then we can get into the Menti and give my voice a break. Okay, bud, if you don't mind, Alex, getting us over. Yeah. So the same code from earlier works again, and we'll get the next question up. Alex, I'm not seeing it yet, just so you know. There we go. Okay, so the question, which of the proposed Southwest station locations do you envision connecting to the most from the Northwest? So if you were riding the train from the Northwest to the Southwest, where do you think that you'd have um, the most ridership, basically? So we've got 8 responses. We've got 23 attendees. So we're at 10, 12. So we're at half. So with about half of our attendees participating in this poll, um, Joe Boone looks like it's coming in with the highest, followed by Murphy Avenue, um, and then followed by MLK. Everything else has 2 or 3 votes. So thank you for that. Uh, next question on the Menti, please. Which of the proposed Southeast station locations do you envision connecting to the most from, let's say, from the Southwest? So we've got 7 responses, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Let's see if we can do better than half. Okay, so In the southeast, it looks like Boulevard is the champ, with Glenwood Ave coming in second with 6 votes, and then Metropolitan Parkway with 4. Um, Hill Street and Cherokee Ave didn't have any votes. Everything else was 1 or 2. Cool. Alex, remind me, is there one more? Okay, yeah. Which of the following factors do you consider most critical in selecting the proposed station locations? So this is accessibility, safety, community development impact, environmental concerns, integration, connectivity with other services, service gaps, or other. So we had one person vote for all of them except other. That's awesome. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So that's right where there's 12. Okay, so that's just proud of half, 13, sweet. Um, Integration and connectivity with other services got 11 votes. Accessibility, safety, community development all got 8. Service gaps got 7, and environmental concerns got 3. So thanks for the feedback. Appreciate that. Um, and then I guess this is the last question. Based on the proposed stations, do you observe any gaps in service or accessibility? If so, which areas, and do you suggest any alternatives? And Nate, since we're starting to run a little bit tight on time, we can get into the Q&A and let this just kind of happen in the background.
I think that's a good idea, and we haven't really had a change in our attendees, so I'm not going to cover the instructions again. It's the
Yep.
same here. We're going to go ahead and take Brian's question in the Q&A. You guys can place things in there now. Questions and comments. Facebook Live, you're welcome to put things in the comments. So the question is, when is the next study group meeting? Spring in regards to Northwest? I'll take that for a quick second, Sean. You
Yep.
correct me if I'm wrong. Our next major, besides the survey that we'll talk about in a second, touch point with the community will be in the first quarter of 2025, maybe February, maybe March. It may be a study group. It could be a full-on citywide conversation. We're still kind of designing that out now as we're receiving all this feedback. Sean, for you, Armor Yards looks too cumbersome to do. Why can't we do as much as we can to get a connection in the infill station of Lindbergh? There's no guarantee that infill stations would come, even with the curve infill station at Murphy Avenue. Why not actually convert to the heavy rails? Connect to the heavy rail station itself.
Sure. So, Brian, thank you for that. We were showing connectivity for all of the locations to the Armor infill station as proposed. That's not to say that that's going to be what is finalized, but we wanted to have that as kind of a consistent endpoint, if you will, for all the corridors. We didn't want to have one end at Armor and then, or 2 end at Armor and 3 end at Lindbergh, and then we're comparing apples and watermelons. So it was just a little bit of I hate to call it a cheat, but it was a little bit of a crutch for us to just look at the network in the Northwest up to an infill station there. And we totally understand that the infill station is just an idea right now. But we wanted to take a look at it, and that's why we've added it, and that's why it's our endpoint. But if there's no infill station at the time, then that a project moves forward in the Northwest, then it will have to go all the way up to Lindbergh to tie in.
Stay on the infill for a second. Are all the alignments and stations locations dependent on the infill stations being built? Those projects are nowhere near starting. In other words, would the infill stations be a prerequisite to rail? And I think you kind of answered it, but just bring it home, Sean.
Yeah, so I wouldn't say they're a prerequisite, especially in the Southwest and the Southeast. So a Joe Boone infill station uh, on the MARTA rail would be absolutely wonderful, but it's not a requirement of the Beltline transit. So transit along the Beltline would have a stop at Joe Boone anyways. And then if if a MARTA infill station is there first, great. But if it comes in after, then that's fine too. We'll get that connectivity, and there would be a walking transfer of about a third of a mile from the stop location at Donnelly Hollowell to get to the Bankhead MARTA station. So that would be, it wouldn't be an awesome transfer, but it would be a reasonable transfer until that infill station were developed. So hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, we have about 4 to 5 more minutes. I want to move around and hear some new voices real quick here. So I'm going to jump around to Mia. Are these proposed stations set in stone or will there be further adjustments? Also, how much longer will data be collected for and when will it be shared with communities?
So, so the data collection is all effectively complete. What we've been doing is analysis of the data that we had available to us and that we went out and sought. So, like working off of the city's, future comprehensive development plan for future land use. That the data set was acquired and it was analyzed geospatially, and that helped us. So we presented a lot of information tonight, and there will be more information to present at the next opportunity this coming spring, winter, spring. So, and then the proposed stations right now are dots on a map. Um, there is a little bit of design being done just to make sure that they can physically fit and to identify potential needs for additional right of way or impacts to the trail where they're adjacent. Um, but for the most part, they're a dot on a map identifying a general location. And so as the projects move from planning into engineering, that's when those station locations will really start to be tightened up. And so the dot is probably covering something on the order of 500 feet along the corridor, and then it could slide within that. And so the engineering, when that starts up in full, that's when that those locations will be tightened up pretty solidly.
Running out of time, so I want to hit a couple design questions because I think you can do these broadly. Question about what the cost of a ride would be, 250. There's a question about whether there be call buttons at stations, so the tram would only stop when somebody wants to board. And then the last sort of design thing is whether or not we'd have indoor stations.
Uh, the station typology is set up to be an outdoor. It's not set up to be conditioned space. It's not set up to be really anything other than a walk-up type of a platform. So if you take loosely the downtown streetcar station locations, you have a raised platform, you have a shelter, you have some kind of a fare vending machine. That would be what you would see on the Beltline, albeit we have a I'll say a higher elevation of architectural detail that we're proposing for that. In terms of calls, um, right now, that is beyond the scope of this. That is one way it could operate, where it just kind of the vehicle keeps going until there's somebody on the platform that the vehicle operator stops for, or there's a stop request from inside the vehicle. That could be a way also of minimizing travel time. You're absolutely right on that. And then in terms of fares, again, we're not to that point yet, but this would be part of the MARTA light rail streetcar network. Right now, it's a $1 fare to ride the downtown streetcar. My assumption is that that would increase when you start to be able to operate and provide service across 22 miles of the city. But MARTA's got another fare system that they're going to roll out over the course of the next several years. Because right now there's no transfer between MARTA bus and rail and the Atlanta streetcar, and that would need to change if when this kind of a larger network becomes available, because it's not reasonable to not it's not reasonable to what's the word I'm trying to say? The transfer between networks needs to be as simple as possible.
Yep, and thank you, Sean. 7:55. I'm going to ask that we hold any additional questions from coming in, and we're going to see if we can knock these out real quick before we close out
Yep.
the meeting. Does this study include the west extension and alignment?
There's an assumption in the service planning where the streetcar has an east extension and a west extension, so that there would be not just the Beltline loop, but there would also be a crosstown linkage, so that to get from west side to east side, you wouldn't necessarily have to ride around the top or the bottom. You could go east west through downtown.
Okay. In the southwest quadrant, what is happening with the alignment at the Lawton Street Bridge? It's only one direction going to go behind the warehouses.
Um, so there is a trail project to link up um, basically Lawton Street through Beltline corridor back to RDA Cascade. That's an active procurement right now, looking for a trail designer. But that trail design doesn't really impact transit. Transit will have to do some additional right-of-way acquisition, but the transit is expected to come in through the main bay underneath the Lawton Street Bridge, and then the trail will come in at that elevation, at a higher elevation to match that plaza at the base of the stairs at Lawton Street underneath the bridge. So there'll still be clearance of headroom underneath, but it'll be coming in at a higher elevation than grade below it. And
And when
then
do
the
we think?
preferred alignment
Mhm.
will be finalized. We're looking at probably March at the earliest of this coming calendar, March of 25.
Thanks, Sean. All right. Well, we got through the questions. Great questions, everyone, by the way. Let's go ahead and knock out this polling real quick, just like we did in the beginning of the meeting. Was the information tonight that we presented helpful in changing your perception and or understanding of the Beltline project? Yes, no, no opinion. All right. And lock that in. 71% participation. Yes. Good. That's what we want to hear. And did you learn something new? Last poll question. I want to make sure y'all see the survey links and whatnot here. Yes, no, need more clarity. Let's see if we can get up to 70, 80%. All right, 100% yes on that. So we're going to go ahead. We got two last slides. We're going to get you guys out of here on time as promised. We want you to know that we're doing a survey. It's going to be open till December 1st. You can see the link on the screen. We have the English version and a Spanish version. Next slide. And that's in the chat as well. But if you just save this one address here, the bit.ly transit study address, you can find the surveys on there as well. So we got the project's website on the screen. It's in the chat. And then if you have questions or comments, or if you didn't have time to write these down as we were trying to get you guys out of here on time, you can always email engage@atlbeltline.org. So that's really easy to remember. Engage@atlbeltline.org. All right. I feel like I almost went too fast there, Sean. We got 2 more minutes. We should ask for more questions. I'm kidding.
My voice can't take it. But
Yeah.
everybody, thank you for joining us. It seems like everybody got something out of this. Again, if you have follow-up questions, please hit engage@atlbeltline.org. And then team, I really appreciate the support tonight. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. We'll see y'all on the Beltline. Good night.